All right. Hello, everybody. I will be going over photon confinement. And I just want to caveat a couple things first. Firstly, I want everyone to know that I do use AI and it helps me to write. But I also have to be careful with it because it leads your intuitions astray, just like how, your left hemisphere does. So your intuitions are what connects you and grounds you in reality. And your intuitions attempt to reconcile those things, systematize them, and divorce them from reality in order to manipulate them. So that's your rationalist left hemisphere, and your right hemisphere is your intuitionist perspective. And that's what's actually grounded in this geometrical understanding of reality and the relationships across true dichotomies. But that's part of my other part of this theory, and this is the resolution of synthesis tiers at the most fundamental aspect. And I don't think that there is anything under light. I've tried to articulate it. I've tried to think of it if you can break down light into something smaller. And basically what I've come to is that it is a single twist of space, and its width is Planck length. So the only way I guess it's possible for it to have other aspects is along its relative aspect. So it can no longer have relativity across Planck length because we wouldn't have access to anything smaller than that. So that would be completely outside of our ability to even have a relative relationship to measure or otherwise interpret anything across the width of a photon. Now it's possible that there's increments similar to how. So another way to think of this is an RNA strand. It looks very much like a photon twisting around its axis, and what basically is happening is it could be that there's segments to a photon, and we can say maybe photons in phase like a laser are just kind of like a DNA strand. It's just like segments of photons overlapping, and maybe that's true. But the basic thing to think about is that currently the way I understand it is photons are fundamental, and it's a single twist of space-time and energy. And this twist actually gets us to the measurement of frequency, of wavelength, etc., because of the amount of energy actually twists it harder relative to whatever else there is around it. So this thing is twisted. The more energy it has, the more it's twisted harder, which contracts its spatial dimension forwards and backwards. But it's always traveling at the speed of light. But it can still contract and expand. So this is its only relative aspect. So the only aspect of a photon that is relative is its what we call wavelength. But it's really just how tight is that single twist? Is it tighter or looser? But it can never be untwisted. So it'll always be a single twist. But is that twist tighter or looser? Is that single twist tighter or looser? In terms of its constriction of space. So, and I know that's a weird way to think of it because it would be an invariant twist. So the twist would always be there. So then it's just like the inside gets tighter. It can expand or contract. Okay. And twist harder or less. So, and this is how we get to an infinite continuous wavelength is you can just say, well, what if I just don't think of this as ever ending, and then it just goes on forever? And this is where we get to the wave-particle duality. It's like, okay, well, why do we think that they end up as a particle? They are always end up as a discrete particle. And this, what I think the reason is constructive and destructive interference. So photons, they go through the slit, but they you can say the things in between the spaces between the slits, which is actually preventing them from actually going to the wall, acts as a destructive interference. So that means everywhere else it's constructive interference. So then they go through the slits. These are the only spaces in which they can constructively interfere, so they will do so. So basically you always have it as a wave, and then it's it's figuring out where the destructive and constructive interference happens, and once it actually interacts with something in a way that constructively interferes with it the most, that's the direction it's going to go. So we call this probability and also a distribution, but this just means that's where it's most likely to have the most constructive interference. So it's always a chance. We'll never have access to a perfect articulation of where it's going to go every time. But at the same time, this is the reason for the collapse, is that it's destructive and constructive interference. And some places, like the center, is always going to have the highest chance because that's the closest plane. But you have to think of the interacting wall as kind of also being warped and like flowing like a wave. So then it's like, okay, well, where on this wavy board is it going to hit? And the chances are, as you get towards where you aimed it at, is going to continue to be higher than the rest. And then it's going to slowly taper off towards the edges. And then you could say that can go off into infinity, but the chances would approach zero as you go off to the observable universe, because obviously at the edge of the observable universe, it would be zero, which is impossible for us to reach. So that's how far it would go, the chances of it being there. And maybe you can assume that it goes outside of that, but it would just be a rationalization because there's no relative aspect to it for us to achieve anything outside of relative reality. And maybe after we die we can, maybe that's where we're judged, is outside of relative reality. But we'll only, in our physical bodies and in physical space, we will only have access to relative reality. And it's possible that relative reality is more true. It's possible that outside of relative reality is more true. But it's also possible that both are equally true, and we need to treat them as equally true. So it's possible that all three of these are true. And that's like the best way to think of it is like in certain circumstances, you would want to think of it in isolation. The reason the whole reason for that articulation is just to say we don't know what's quite real. We just know that relative reality is the thing we have access to. So, but in order to operate within relative reality, we need to understand the nature of true dichotomies and those rationalized extremes. So maybe they're rationalized because they're more real, but then what you would have to ask is that rationalized extreme the result of our left hemisphere or our right hemisphere? And if it's the right hemisphere, then it's true. If it's the left hemisphere, it's untrue. And if it's both, then the truth is likely both. And we're going to figure that out also. So I think that the right answer may be both, that relative reality and ideal reality may be true, but our left hemisphere will try to divorce us from these two aspects or divorce one from the other. And maybe that's something we have to reconcile and compromise between those perspectives. But this is where you have that like insane like understanding of reality. It's like so for example, if you don't know what I'm talking about, so you have absolute zero as a concept. So like we know that we can't actually reach this. It would require infinite energy in order to reach this concept of absolute zero. Well, what is the concept of absolute zero if it doesn't exist in reality? Well, it acts as, you could say, a mediator for all of relative reality. And if that being gives rise to everything, so if Planck temperature and absolute zero, those entities give rise to all of relative reality of temperature, then are those things that gave rise to relative reality more real, or is all of relative reality more real? So is Planck temperature and absolute zero real entities that give rise to this relative reality? It's almost like they exist, but everything in between them is a result of them conflicting or compromising, or equilibrium, disequilibrium between them. And it, from my perspective, it's both. Like both of these things are real. Like the rationalized extreme is real, and the true dichotomy that resolves into the spectrums that we see. So this is why it's the most true. It's a true dichotomy because it is dichotomous, and it's true because it's a spectrum. But if you ever divorce these things from each other, it leads you to a misunderstanding of reality in one way or another. Excuse me. Okay. But I may be wrong in my articulation. Maybe I'll think of something different in the future. But regardless, so you have photon confinement. And then we say, currently what I'm treating it as is that they enter photon confinement at Planck length and they expand right now based on h bar times the speed of light divided by energy, which basically gets you to the reduced Compton wavelength. And that's currently what I estimate the size of particles to be. And the argument currently is that particles are point-like because of scattering effects when we collide them together. And people don't think of it this way, but if you do think of photons as being, or like, sorry, not photons alone, but if you do think of these particles, such as electrons and all these others, as being spherical, then what you would expect is them to scatter in random directions. And they say, we don't see that. And this will be something I have to figure out and I have to answer, because maybe it's just geometrically at that amount of space when you collide these particles that they do just behave like single points in terms of where they contact, because of the size and scale of what we're dealing with. But if it does end up being a distribution, which I'd have to look at low energy collisions, because high energy collisions will probably cause to break photon confinement, because I also have to measure like how strong is that confinement. So we'd have to measure different particles at different sizes, and then we can get a ratio of how much the size of the particle changes the amount of energy it takes to break it apart. And then once you do that, well, then it could be a resolution of it not having anything else around it, so it just resolves back into that particle. But I think eventually we'll figure out exactly how much energy it takes to break photon confinement, or pop the bubble, you could say. And so when we just think of an electron, though, I mean, I haven't even gone through any of this yet. So this is just a work in progress anyways. Like, I feel like a lot of this might even be wrong based on my current understanding, because I write this as I go, and then I have to go back and update it because I'll figure out something new that was wrong. But basically, right now, you can think of these photons as having different orientations and helicities. So if you have two photons, oh, here, let me pull up the pictures. What am I doing? I don't even know why I didn't put them on yet. Okay, so you have, I hate that I made this picture, but I was trying to do some stuff. Okay, where's photon confinement? Okay, I think this is it. Okay, yeah, this is my model of most of light. So you have it treated like a wave. This is before it's constructively or destructively interfered with, and it resolves in space based on that destructive and constructive interference. But this is what a photon more or less looks like. And it's just a single twist of a beam that's twisted. That's why we call it a beam of light, because it makes up the structure of everything. And it's one, so this is from the front. So if it was coming straight at us, or I guess moving straight away from us, it would just be a circle, because it would complete it over itself. So, and neither of these would be perfect. So there would be some aspect to this that is not quite perfect. And that's because if photons were perfect, then there would be no asymmetry to anything. Like, we are asymmetrical. One of our faces is bigger than the other. So there has to be asymmetry at the most fundamental aspect of reality, or else we wouldn't have anything. Everything would be perfectly the same if everything was perfectly symmetrical. So people don't realize that if there wasn't an excess of energy, then we wouldn't have anything. Okay, regardless. So this is how we can think of light. So it's just a spinning single twist of space, time, and energy. Has one Planck length of width, which gives rise to all relative length. It doesn't necessarily have Planck units of energy. Or, sorry, there is no aspect of energy that can't be measured in an infinite degree. So this means that twist can be arbitrarily tight or loose all the way to from 0 to Planck temperature. So you can twist this until there's almost zero space, but you can never quite twist it all the way till there's zero space between these twists. So, but you can also loosen it to where this wave basically extends almost the entire universe. But like it doesn't really help anybody, you know? Like it would basically not be able to have a receive. There's nothing to receive anymore for anything relative to it. And it would require us to make basically something that would probably be the size of the universe in order to make a wavelength that big. But regardless, okay, so this is pretty dense. So you have spin angular momentum. Like orbital angular momentum isn't really that relevant unless you're creating specific type. Like these are mostly made in labs. Obviously, they can be made in certain types of stars and etc. But spin angular momentum is really the thing to pay attention to, because as you can see, like this would be like if a photon was moving through space at the speed of light, like this one right here, this is that. So this would be from the front, right? So this circle, if you copy and pasted it right here, this thing is rotating depending on its helicity. So it's either over the top to the right, which would be, I guess if this was facing you, it would be the wrong way, but this would be to the left if you turned it around, and this would be to the right. So this thing, depending on our perspective of it, if it's moving away from us, then this would be right-handed. If it's moving towards us, it would be left-handed. So that's how you think of helicity, but the spin angular momentum of that helicity, so this is how much momentum it has from its spin, is Planck's constant. So this is actually what he's measuring, is how much energy is being generated by this twist in its rotation. And you can almost think of it like an auger. It's like that twisting motion that's being generated is the same for all photons. So this will always be the same, even though you can say there's still a slight relative aspect to it that we'll never be able to measure perfectly. You have to think of this as the most perfectly measurable aspect of reality is Planck's constants. But they're rationalized extremes. Regardless, they're very useful ones. Okay, so this is what the geometry of a photon looks like. Even though this isn't 100% accurate, and will likely require updating, as I drew this in paint. Like, come on, there's no way this is perfectly accurate to reality, but it's just to give you kind of an intuitive understanding of what this looks like, and that the twisting of this thing is how we derive that wavelengths, what those wavelengths are. So it's a single twist, and then just all we do is just assume that twist happens over and over again, because it kind of is. As it's corkscrewing through space, that's exactly the path it would look like. But it's doing it at speed of light, and it also, until it resolves and actually engages in something in relative reality, it is a constant corkscrew. So you can think of it as corkscrewing, stretching out, and then when it finally hits it, smacks all that energy into it. So that's what this twist is. It's just a twist of energy. Okay. So once you say, okay, if I have two of these twists collide, then all you have to do is understand the particle identity thresholds. And this is another thing. Where is it? Open. So, right. Where did I put it? here it is. Okay. So obviously this is for a single particle, but this is all it really takes to manifest these particles. But you need to manifest their antiparticle too if you're just using photons. But that's why in the beginning, protons actually had to manifest a neutral particle. Because, I mean, I guess there's no specific reason, I guess. Let me think. Why couldn't a photon alone manifest electrons and anti-electrons? So it may be possible for anti-electrons and electrons to have manifested the symmetry. Okay. So the reason why electrons and anti-electrons wouldn't be able to exist is because, or the positrons wouldn't be able to have existed is because there's a symmetrical number of electrons and protons. So if it were the case that the universe didn't have only neutrons at the beginning, it would mean that there would be a different number of electrons and protons. So if it was just the universe randomly selecting, like, okay, I'm just going to collide photons together to make electrons here and collide them together to make protons over here, we would expect there to not necessarily need to be an equal amount of each one of these things. And maybe that just cancels out over time. Like it'll manifest particle, antiparticle, or antiparticle, and then as it just chose one or the other, the universe, that you could say, chose to annihilate all these antiparticles into electron neutrinos, then basically like that may have been what happened. But this event only happened once. Whatever happened to create what we call baryon asymmetry only happened once, and it will only ever happen once. So I guess it's not necessary in order to understand what I'm trying to say, but the collision of photons and the fact that they can make every other particle shows that photons are fundamental. And the fact that no other particle can collide and make a photon shows that photons are fundamental as well. So it's, even though you can say they, when they collide, photons fly off of them, photons are fundamental. Like, I just don't see any reason to believe that photons are somehow generated from interactions. Those photons always existed. It's kind of like saying, oh, a human, humans are particles, we're particles, and then based on our interactions, actually atoms fly off of us. It's like, no, we're made of atoms. Atoms come up this synthesis order and existed before us as human beings, like our category of existence, our synthesis tier. Atoms existed before us, and it was a necessary component in order for us to exist. Just in the same way that photons, if this is true, were a necessary category in order for the next tier of all these relative particles to exist. Now, I can start to go through all the reasons why these particles exist and under what contexts, but let me just summarize most of them, because most of them can kind of, here, I can just pull up another picture diagram. So this is just to convey that all the different characteristics that emerge, and this is where I was trying to draw patterns between like different charges and stuff. I'm like, okay, well there's different amounts of each one of these particles, but they eventually all cancel out to neutral. But yeah, and so does the arrangement of the twist too. So like all twists cancel out. So left and right helicity photons would cancel out to no energy. Or what we call polarization. So it wouldn't be lack of energy, it would just be lack of helicity. And then you would just have pure energy after that. It would just be the pure contraction of and expansion of space, which is what polarized light is. Okay, what am I doing? I need to open a new one. Then I'm opening spin identity. Okay, this is my current formulation of how particles get spin. And it's geometrical, completely geometrical from photons' orbit. So if they have opposite helicity, this means that they're in the same plane with opposite helicity, so they're rotating opposite of each other. Then this particle has 0 spin. If they're in the same helicity on the same plane, then it has spin 2. If it is opposite helicity but opposite plane, it's spin 1/2. And if it's the same helicity, which this diagram is hard to actually see this, like what this actually looks like, because it's from the photon's perspective. So like if this photon was traveling to the right, this would be right-handed helicity, and then you would say, is this one traveling down or up? And that would depend on its helicity here. But as long as they have the same helicity and opposite helicity here, then you get these two different particle identities. So then we ask, okay, well, do these spin 1 particles have charge? Do they have all these other effects? If not, then we have to figure out another answer for this. But this is the current orientation that I believe to be the case for all spin 1/2 particles. And I think this one is the most true out of all of these. So regardless of any of these other examples exist, this is the one I think exists, has the highest chance of being something. So what is going on with these? And this may be just how all of them are. And maybe it just changes based on its orientation, because that's another thing that changes within these is the orientation of their fields. So let's start here. So if the magnetic field is oriented around the outside, so towards, so you have to think of these things, like you have to think of the photon as being locked in its position of its magnetic field and electric field as it's going around this. So it's almost like the photon is in line with its twisting, its rate of twist. So as it's spinning, so if it's in orbit, it's actually spinning at the same rate in a tidal lock, almost, you can think of it as. So if this is the case, then the directionality of its magnetic field and its electric field would generate, depending on its orientation, its charge and its magnetic field. So if the charge, and this is like something I'm researching right now, but the way I currently understand it is if the electric field is oriented inward, so it'd be inside of this confined particle, then it generates a negative charge. So it's actually negative charge inside. And if it's oriented outwards, it creates a positive charge. Excuse me. And this is what gives it negative or positive charge. And then the next thing is the magnetism. So it creates a dipole as a result of these particles going around and it generating a magnetic field. So, and it's also possible that one of these has theirs oriented inward and the other outward, to where like the one going around has its electric field oriented outward, generating a magnetic field, and the other has the magnetic field oriented inward, creating its charge. So this is very difficult for me to reconcile right now because I'm so new to these concepts and like exactly how it looks. And I don't know exactly which one causes the other. So it's like, if an electric field going around the side is what's giving rise to its magnetic field, then the one going around the middle part would have its electric field oriented outwards. But then, so that would create its dipole. But then you could say if the one rotating on the y plane has its magnetic field oriented a certain way, or electric or magnetic field oriented a certain way, then it's going to generate its charge. So it may be the one that's oriented a certain way. That's the one that is generating the magnetic field. Therefore, it's likely using its electric field to generate that magnetic field. Okay, so we're going to figure this out geometrically, and it's going to be very simple. It's just figuring out which one causes which and how these fields are oriented inside of this confined particle. And this is why it's nascent, like it's new, because it's very simple though. Like this is so simple in terms of it's just how we know all of these forces to manifest and like other things. So like a generator, like an electric generator, it behaves exactly the same way as each one of these particles. And then basically this would be the size of the particle. So it's generating almost like a light barrier, you could say, around this particle. But it also has a magnetic field around that. So it's like if something reacts to that magnetic field, people are like, oh, it interacted with the particle. Well, it's like if it interacts with this electric field that it's generating by going around, people are saying like, okay, this is a different aspect of the particle, and it's just all fields. And there's some truth to that, but it's like at some point you're interacting with something physical or magnetic. And those are the two things that you can have. So electricity may bind it to having a physical aspect, and then magnetism is the two sizes of these particles. Like even us, we have you can say a little bit of magnetism to us as well, but it's always trying to remain neutral, and we are pretty neutrally charged, but we can become positively charged, which is why we can, rub our feet against the carpet and create a little electric shock. And regardless, so this is what I'm currently thinking of how spin actually manifests in reality. And this is why I think that quantum mechanics is very wrong, even though it has some things right, like the idea of wave-particle duality. But it's not quite what they think, because it's still classical. It's just where that thing resolves is due to constructive and destructive interference. So it's not like this wonky superposition understanding. It has nothing to do with that. It's just purely constructive and destructive interference of waves, and they resolve into particles, which is the most discrete possible form of this wave. It's almost like a wave on the ocean. Like if you were to imagine them interacting, where they clash and the wave rises up, we call that a particle at the very tip, and say like we assume perfect resolution of this particle. But really what's happening is constructive and destructive interference of these waves that are colliding and manifesting this energy at a certain point. But the ocean is still made of water molecules, and this ocean is made of light molecules. They're not really molecules. They are fundamental particles, but that's the way you got to think of it. It's like a giant ocean of photons at the fundamental level. Like we're thinking of this before relative particles even exist. So this is the emergence of relative particles, is when these things enter confinement. And then because it's generating mass, because if you think of two photons hitting each other, they lose, like they're no longer going the speed of light in any direction relative to each other. Now they're confined and they're going around each other at the speed of light. And then if you have two particles going around each other at the speed of light, this is a relationship. So at first it's all light, it's all one thing, and it's pure space-time and energy, or the first manifestation of space-time and energy. But then there is something likely beyond that. But regardless, that's the first synthesis, and it's the first thing that came into existence. And it's both metaphysically true in terms of all the religion, like some of the religions were saying, and it's scientifically shown to be the case based on this model. And it's going to be shown to be true, I think so. Because it just makes sense. Like the dipoles, the reason why all these spin 1/2 particles have dipoles is precisely because of this orientation. And yeah, it's gonna be fun. It's gonna be and I'm kind of excited because I don't kind of want all the answers. I want us to be able to figure this out together. And I just need to get this information out there so other people can join me in this adventure, because it's going to be so amazing. Like the amount of things that are going to come from this that are amazing, but we have to be spiritually, metaphysically, and all these other things. We need to be ready for this understanding, because the amount of things and progress that this understanding will give people is going to be something that we need to be responsible for. And that means we need to be responsible individuals, people who other people can rely on, people who've been through and integrated themselves in reality in these ways. And we need to have this, you could say, massive spiritual awakening, because everybody seems spiritually dead. And I think my articulation of synthesis tiers and true dichotomies will at least be one way in which people pursue this. So there's many ways to get to these understandings, and I think mine is a pretty decent one and does a good job of it. And maybe like we can improve it and change it over time. And like I think that we're like I'm not articulating necessarily anything completely new or trivial besides maybe this and some other things, but there's some additions that I've made, but the underlying pieces of the puzzle have already been built by all these people. It's kind of like we have an infinite number of pieces, and then there's certain people who have been doing a really good job at pulling some of these pieces out and saying, here's the few pieces that I have of this puzzle, but I can't quite reconcile with the picture that they make. And then you got like Einstein over here with E equals mc squared and a general relativity, and then you have quantum mechanics bringing in some truth, and then you have like all these, you have Hegel, you have all Rousseau, all these people articulating little pieces of all this thing, and all someone needs to do is package them all together into one physical and metaphysical understanding, and that's what I'm trying to do. So whether or not I'm able to do that, or this does a good or bad job of that, that's my goal and that's my pursuit, because I think it'll be helpful to get people to reconcile the differences between our scientific understanding and our religious understanding of the world. And if we don't do that, then we're going to continue to have these issues where we're conflicting in terms of our metaphysical and physical understanding of the world. And in doing that, we're divorcing ourselves from each other in these two perspectives. It's almost like if I have a religious understanding or an intuitive or a spiritual understanding of the world, and it conflicts with this systematic rationalization of the world, then I start to develop either my own rationalizations of the world based on just random intuitions, or I start to develop my own intuitions based on my rationalizations. And this is how you get to utilitarianism. And this is how you get to like furrydom and all these LGBTQ philosophies and postmodernism and all these other things, is that have these unresolved intuitions that have no system or structure about them. And the other one has all these structure, but no intuitions that they can connect them to. So it's like, on one hand, we're trying to connect our intuitions to our rationalizations, and that's leading us to all these weird, crazy ideas. And then our rationalizations are conflicting with our intuitions, and it's just like we're deeply confused right now. And this is what I'm trying to reconcile, and this is my whole goal. This is what I've sought out to do, and I didn't realize I was trying to do it. But at first, it was just trying to reconcile science and religion. But I feel like it's just so much deeper now. There is seriously two different patterns of being that we're articulating, and they're conflicting right now. And in a Hegelian aspect, I think they will resolve in this synthesis. And maybe there's going to be many people that probably come up with their own syntheses. But I think mine is scientifically, metaphysically, and physically true, in other words. So you can observe it, and you can see the patterns that emerge from different aspects of interactions at different levels. Regardless, I'm seeking the truth. And if what I'm saying is not true, then I do question myself all the time. And I think that's a necessary aspect in order to fully understand reality, is you have to be able to remain uncertain, because reality is uncertain. So if part of reality is uncertain, then you better be uncertain. And I know I don't have all the answers, and I find that kind of appealing because I don't want to have all the answers. I don't want to just be finished. And I think we'll never be finished in understanding the world through an intuitive and unintuitive or a rational way. So, and this endless pursuit will always be beneficial for us. So finding the truth and doing it through love, reciprocity, cooperation, and mutuality, all of these things, all these concepts together, doing it together is always what's going to lead us forward, and doing it for the sake of our relationship to other people. So don't ever do something for yourself, and we don't do things for ourselves. Most people are always doing things for other people. Like everything you do, like if you did something only for yourself, then you lose your relationship with everybody else and the rest of reality. And you can see that whenever somebody is acting this way, like you're put off by it, and you're like, with a big corporation like does something bad, then you're just like, well, now I have this pattern of being within these corporations that I think is bad. And then, but there's also individual people that are doing that. You have to remember that they're making these decisions, and maybe it's on a collective behalf, but then you're just saying you're divorcing each one of these individuals' responsibilities from the whole, and you're saying the whole is responsible, but these individuals aren't. And this is where I think we run into issues with how we treat people. We should always treat people as individuals, and obviously people can be collectively still responsible, but they're individually responsible for whatever happens within that collective. So, I mean, even though we do have guilty by association, we can still say, hey, this person within that association killed somebody while this other person was just there to rob them. Like, they're both not equally guilty of murder. This person did it. And obviously, sometimes that's hard to delineate, and we just kind of say both of you are responsible. But this is basically the thing I'm talking about there. But regardless, I'm getting kind of off topic here. But all this stuff is connected, so it's hard to ever divorce them from each other. Okay, so this is helicity, or just spin identity, and it's the result of the differences in helicity of the photons in confinement. And currently, like, this is some weird abstract thing that quantum mechanics does. So, like, the biggest things I disagree with in quantum mechanics is the understanding of spin and the understanding of the particle wave duality. I don't think that they understand what it is that's actually happening. It's not like a binary where it's like, oh, it's a wave now, and oh, now it's a particle. No, it's like a resolution of that particle in more or less space, depending on constructive and destructive interference. So it always maintains its identity and like amount of energy, but it's like it's constructive and destructive in space, and that's what's happening. So it's resolving its place in space through constructive and destructive interference. And it eventually resolves at a point, which we measure. But in that measurement, it's where all that energy was released, because obviously two spheres interacting will only ever do so at a point. It'll never collide at like any other, like two balls will always collide at a point. And that's why it's like they are spherical. And that's why we do get point-like nature from their interactions. So it's either that or the direct center of these particles is actually smashes together to where it looks like a point, and then they're almost like little bubbles that deform. So those are the two possible answers for that. And it's not just like, I don't even know, just 2 points, because it makes no sense. Like if we were to think this was possible, then we would have to, so either two things are possible. It's possible that particles are point-like, or it's possible to have infinite energy. So if things could have zero volume, that would require them to have infinite energy. And if two things interact at a point, that means there's infinite energy at that point. And this is why those assumptions also break down in quantum physics. And this is why it makes no sense. Like you just have to ignore all the other aspects of physics in order to get what people in quantum physics think to be true. Even though some of the things they articulate are true, it's kind of like saying human beings are pure evil. And it's like, okay, well, and here's all the examples of them being pure evil. And you're like, okay, well, I see your examples. I see that Hitler was a pretty bad guy and he did awful things to a lot of people. But like you're ignoring all the other things. You're ignoring these other aspects that you haven't reconciled. And the same is true for general relativity, because it's assuming a perfectly flat space, like completely continuously flat space, but there's all these little ripples. So if we were to think of like it's just a series of small fluctuations, as well as these larger holes, which from that scale seems to be perfectly continuous in nature, then that's all we need is to understand that you can't have perfectly continuous nature, and that's the assumption there. And then all the assumptions of asymptotes. It's like if you're measuring something asymptotically, like the position of something in general relativity, is it really in that space? Like you've just assumed that because that's where the asymptote leads you if you just make that assumption. And I have actually a picture of that. Okay. So if a particle has a volume, what we'd be doing is taking this asymptotic measurement and just assuming that this point right here where we get this measurement is where the particle is. But no, it's actually taking up this much space. It's warping this much space, even though it's really tiny. And this is the result of photon confinement, which gives rise to relativity. So, but this is the fault with relativity, is that it assumes this asymptotic nature of position and etc. Whereas we call it probabilistic, and it is probabilistic, but it's because we don't have access to the probability, or sorry, because it's probable doesn't means we don't have access to exactly what's going to happen or exactly how that's going to take place, because we would have to be able to create a model that perfectly maps onto reality and all the fluctuations and everything in order to understand it. And this means that maybe it's a combination of determinism and free will that are true. So it's free will in that you cannot perfectly predict things at the large scale from the small scale, and you can't do the same in the reverse. So if you cannot ever predict things even at the smallest scale, how are you going to predict them at the large scale? Like, it makes no sense. It's like if things are uncertain at some level of the analysis, then they're uncertain at the rest of the analysis. And obviously we can say, like, predicting the weather, there's a proportional amount of certainty that we can have, and it's proportional to the amount of complexity. And we are very complex. The world is very complex, and there's infinite complexity. So the degree of complexity within the specific system you're trying to measure is going to be proportional to the probability of any given thing happening. So, yeah. And this is my first actual attempt at fully articulating this theory and model. But the next thing for me to do is try to show where the fields are oriented. So this is the orientation of the field orientation of a photon. But eventually, well, let's see if I have... here we go. Okay, here's what it looks like when they're in confinement with each other. So let's go with negative first. So the electric fields are oriented inwards. The magnetic field is oriented outwards. So you can imagine this thing either spinning to the left or right, and it's generating a magnetic field so it's in the direction of its spin. So positive charge has its electric field oriented outwards, and you could just imagine it twisting as it goes around. So the electric field is actually changing its orientation as it goes around. And I guess the magnetic field too, because it would be creating that dipole moment. So like this would be the top of the particle right here, and the magnetic field would go around it because of this rotation through that. So it'd be going around and around and around. And this electric field is oriented outwards. You could say in like a bubble. I guess it might even be from this part. Magnetic field of this photon right here is oriented outwards. And then it's outwards. And this creates its positive charge. And this one I would have negative charge. So the other way it's possible is the opposite, where the magnetic fields are oriented outwards and the electric fields are oriented in the direction of rotation. So this would be going this way. The electric field would generate the magnetic field, which would be as a result of it moving through this space around through here. So we go, and it's generating this magnetic field. And because the magnetic field is oriented outwards, that's what's generating charge. And this would be inwards generating charge. And maybe I have these backwards. Regardless, the intuition's there. And now it's just a matter of learning the language and exactly what's happening, the relationship between these. So and it may not even be any of these. It may just be a combination, like somehow there's whatever gets to the right answer is what's going to be the correct formulation of what this is. I just want to let you guys know that this is my current understanding of it, and I'm getting closer and closer to what is actually true of it. And yeah, all I have to do is understand what's generating the field, the magnetic field, and what's generating the charge. And I think it's more likely that the electric field is generating the charge, depending on its orientation, either the field's oriented outwards or inwards, and the magnetic field generates the magnetic field based on its rotation. So yeah, and it makes sense. And the video is getting pretty long, but I thank you guys. I love you so much, and I hope that we can all come to a better understanding of reality through this model. And I've actually been thinking, I don't know, I keep thinking about changing the name of it, because I'll tell you guys the story about it. But basically I thought, I guess I can tell you now, and you guys can just end the video now if you're, because I'm pretty much done articulating where I'm currently at in it. But so the name, it's called Tsunami. And one day I was like, I started just sitting there. I was super calm. I was like almost meditating, and I just kind of breathed out a word. And I was like, I've never heard this word before. And I started looking it up. And obviously this is kind of weird, but I started looking up original languages and stuff like that, because I said tsunami, and I was like I was trying to look up a few different versions of it. I was I saying tsunami, like a wave? Like I was like, oh, that's interesting. I can show a connection between here, and then I was like, no, I'm saying tsunami, and then I looked up tsunami as Zuname, and I was looking at like ancient languages and stuff, and I came to Zu-nam-mi, and it's, I think it's, what is it again? One of the first ancient languages. I forgot what it is. Sumerian, I think, ancient Sumerian. Yes. Okay, Sumerian. And what it means is to know the wisdom, to have wisdom and to know the path of our destiny. And I was like, wow, it's just crazy that this is exactly what I think I'm articulating, is like this is how to stay on the path, how to orient ourselves on the path. And it's kind of scary because like I don't want to think of myself as like somebody who's articulating something that deep, but if I have to be the one to do it, I'm willing to take on that responsibility, and I'll hold that responsibility with as much humility as I can, and I'll try to remain oriented towards other people, and I'll try not to give in to my hedonism, my self-gratification, and I'll look to others to hold me accountable to do that. And I'll also understand criticism that I receive for the things that I will be saying, but I'll try to take those criticisms in and try to make them a part of the process, because that's necessary. It's necessary to hold myself accountable as somebody articulating these things, if it's true, and the responsibility I have to the people that will end up accepting this to be true. And just remember that I'm just a man, and I have to remember that as well. And everybody can understand this, is basically what I'm saying. Like, the reason I came to these conclusions is because of my framework and my intuitions, not because of the conclusions that I've drawn from how we currently articulate or rationalize reality. So if it's true, just remember your intuitions are much more important than your rationalizations. And we need to pay attention to our intuitions much more, especially in our current day and age where we ignore ourselves, we ignore our humanity, we ignore our relationship with everyone else. And the beauty of how strong our relationships could be. And Jesus, that was his whole purpose, was to show us what humanity could be if we all just aimed up together. And obviously not everybody's going to be able to do that. Some people are just naturally molded, like everybody has the capability of being good, but some people are predisposed to automatically having it being much harder for them, and that's the demons that they have to fight. Regardless, that's getting into more metaphysical and psychological stuff. I'm just trying to articulate fundamental physics and re-articulate it, so hopefully this made sense at all, and I am getting closer. But remember, electrons are the result of neutron decay. So even though they have these characteristics and we can manifest them in electron-positron pairs in labs, those temporary particles are just that. They're temporary, because even though we can maintain them, if we never allow these anti-electrons to hit another electron, like eventually it's going to touch another the positron will hit another electron, and it'll annihilate that one. So really all we did was exchange that identity with another electron. So it just equalized again. So we didn't actually create anything new. It's almost like the wind. We made a new set of wind, basically, of quantum wind. Anyways, I hope that made sense. All right. Again, I love talking about this stuff so much, and I hope that eventually I'm going to ask people to talk about this stuff, people that are even I'll I really want to talk to everybody about it. And as I eventually get more followers, eventually get more recognition, I'll be able to hold much more conversations about this. And I think that would be much more fruitful. And maybe even I can talk to AI about it. And I don't know. I just don't think it's good at intuitively understanding the things I'm articulating. Because it just always resolves back to like, oh, this isn't currently how I understand it to be in quantum mechanics. And I'm like, okay, well, stop your assumptions and maybe you'll see the truth. And but now I have it really persuaded of this being true. So if I was able to persuade ChatGPT, I think most people can understand what I'm saying, at least enough to not call it nonsense. That is. All right. Peace, guys.